Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lesson 3 in our Animal Camera series. I hope you had a great week watching animals on animal cams from around the world and studying their behaviors. The favorite thing that I saw was these elephants drinking water during sunset in Africa. Isn't that cool? Let's take a look at how the rest of today's lesson is going to go.
During today's lesson, we will analyze the data we collected and try to figure out what patterns are in it. We will be using a few paper and digital materials that you can find links to in the description of this video. Your homework due for today is to have finished your data collection and have all your data in a paper or digital spreadsheet that is ready for you to make graphs with. Before we go too far into today's lesson, I would love to hear the highlights of what you have seen so far in this project. Take a moment and leave a comment about what was the most interesting thing you've seen while studying animal behavior using these webcams. Now that we have all our data collected, we need to figure out how to graph it. There are two main types of graphs that you can use to do this, a bar graph and a scatter plot. A bar graph is a great way to display the number or count of some things in different categories. As you can see in my example, I have a bar graph where I'm graphing the number of different animals seen. On the vertical axis, I have the number of times I saw an animal, and on the horizontal axis, I have the type of animal. Your horizontal axis could be the type of animal, or maybe the type of behavior you observed. The other type of graph that you might use to graph your data is a scatter plot. Scatter plots are great for when you're comparing two different types of numbers. For example, in my graph, I'm comparing how the temperature affects the number of animals seen. Each dot on my graph is one trial where I counted the number of animals I saw in 5 minutes and then looked up the temperature for the location that I was doing the experiment in. All of my results were from the webcams in Africa. As you can see with my scatter plot, I saw more animals when it was colder than when it was warmer. Sometimes we might need to reorganize the rows and columns in our data sheet in order to graph our data. Let's take a look at how we can do that now. Here is my data sheet. Let's look at how I can organize my data to make graphs using the data sheet that I collected. As you can see on the left, I have each trial that I conducted. Then I had the location where the camera was, the time of day and local time, the weather, the temperature, the type of animal, the time of day, and then the number of times I observed each animal behavior. I have them going across right here. What I am interested in doing is seeing how different behaviors might be different at the 3 different types of day that I collected data: during the daytime, around sunset, and at nighttime. To do this, I want to sort the data based on time of day and compare the behaviors for each one. I set this up on the next tab over here, where you can see that I have the time of day and then the number of times I saw each behavior. I have it organized so that all the times I measured during the day are the same, the sunset are in the same block, and then at night are in the same block. What I want to do is create an average number of times I saw each animal behavior during the day, sunset, and nighttime. To calculate an average, remember, we add up all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers. So I did that here. Right here, I added up how many times I saw each of these behaviors during the day, the sunset, and at night. The next thing I did was I divided this number by the number of trials, how many times I watched animal behavior during the day, sunset, or nighttime. I have this right below here. As you can see, I saw eating and drinking the most during the day. In order to make a graph out of this, in Google Sheets, I can just select all of these cells here and go to the Insert Chart function. I did that below here and made this graph. It's pretty easy to see that the most common behavior I saw was eating and drinking, and I saw it the most during the day. However, there are a few other things that I saw more frequently at night and during the sunset. So the types of animal behaviors they do can change depending on the time of day. If you have any questions on how to make graphs in Google Sheets, there's a guide for how to do this linked in the description of the video. If you have any questions about how to make a graph, you can also email me at spencer@headwatersscienceinstitute.org. So now you should take a moment and make your graphs. You can pause this video while you work and then restart it once you've finished making the graphs that you think are most relevant to the question that you were studying. Now that you've completed your graph, or graphs, you might have two, we can look at our data and try and figure out what it all means. A great place to start is with these 5 questions. Take a moment and write out answers on scratch paper to these 5 questions. The first 3 are here. What animals did you observe the most and least? The second is, what behaviors did you observe the most and least? And the third is, what does your data show us about how time, weather, or other animals affect animal behavior? It's important to start with your most basic findings, and then in the next 2 questions, we'll talk a little bit more about what these findings might mean. These next 2 questions are going to challenge you to think a little bit more deeply about the patterns in your data. The first is, what are your main findings about animal behaviors and how animals spend their day? This is asking you to think a little bit about, what did we learn about animal behavior in general and how an animal might spend its day-to-day time and what they do. The second question asks you to compare your data to the claim that you had in your claim evidence reasoning from lesson 1. How does what you found compare to what you predicted you would find? Be sure to reference your graph and evidence when answering this question. Nice job. You've graphed your data and put some serious thought into what it all means. The next step we have for you is to create a scientific presentation or poster so that you can share your results with the rest of the scientific community. This is a really important part of the sciences. You have two options to share your research with the rest of the world. The first is a scientific poster. You can download the template for that in the description of this video. The scientific poster is something you can do on a computer or with pen and paper and is a little bit shorter. Your second option is to create a PowerPoint presentation of your work. This is great because it includes great options for you to share your graphs and some pictures of your research. You can find a template for a PowerPoint presentation linked in the description of this video. The PowerPoint presentations look a little bit nicer than the scientific poster, but they also take a little bit more work. Right now, I'm actually going to give a scientific presentation to you about my research on animal behavior to give you an example of what one of these presentations could look like. Just a reminder before we get into that, your homework will be to finish your scientific presentation, whether it's a poster or a PowerPoint, and share it with your family, your friends, your teachers, and me, Spencer at Headwaters Science Institute. All right, here is my presentation on studying animal behavior with animal cameras.
Hi everyone, here is my presentation on studying animal behavior with animal cameras. I am Spencer Usden from Headwaters Science Institute, and this was the coolest thing that I saw in my presentation, an elephant drinking water during sunset in Africa. So why are we doing this research? For centuries, scientists have been studying animal behavior by watching animals and making observations. However, during the COVID-19 outbreak, many scientists and students like you are stuck at home and can't make these animal observations. I and the rest of Headwaters were wondering if we could use web cameras on the internet to study animal behavior. So why do we study animal behavior? Studying animal behavior is important because it allows us to better understand the needs of different types of animals. This tells us how we can best protect them and provide habitats that can help them be alive and healthy. Many of the animals I watched in Africa were endangered species like elephants, and it's really important that we know what these animals need to survive so that we can protect them and keep them happy and healthy. So what was my research question? My research question were generally what factors affect animal behavior, but specifically I was interested in how does the time of day affect the types of behavior animals were doing. My prediction was that we would see more types of animals and types of animal behaviors during the daytime. I thought that this would because it's warmer and easier to see during the day, it might be easier for animals to find food. These gazelles right here look like they may be having a hard time finding food to eat during the dark, and it might be easier to find something to eat during the day. So how did we do our experiment? The materials we used were pretty simple. We used a data collection sheet, a stopwatch, a web browser, and some of the webcams on explore.org. Here's an example of one here. It's daytime where I am in California right now, but in Africa, it's nighttime. You can see a couple birds on this camera over here. So how we did our experiment was we started by writing down where the camera was, and we recorded the time, weather, and other animals around in the webcam during the time that we did that recording. Every time we watched an animal camera,
We did it for 5 minutes, and we made tally marks for every type of animal behavior we saw, whether it was eating, drinking, fighting, swimming, or whatever we saw. So, what did we find? Let's take a look at the types of animals we saw first to give you an idea as to what we're thinking about. So here we have the average number of animals we saw per trial during the night, sunset, and day. As you can see, during the day, we saw a lot of birds and elephants right here. We saw different types of animals during the night and the day. As you can see, we only saw antelope at night as well as bats. And things like frogs, we didn't actually see, but we could hear a ton of them on the microphone from the webcam. I will say that the bird, cricket, insect, and frog data we have is a little bit of an estimate because we could hear many of them on the microphone of the webcam, but we didn't actually see which one was which. So we gave it a number that we called 15. Really, there were probably more than 15, but we can just say that we know there were a lot of birds, or a lot of crickets, insects, and frogs at the day that we saw. We also saw a couple rabbits, a giraffe, even a crocodile. So, thinking of our question, when do we see more animal behaviors? At night, sunset, or during the day? We thought that we would see more animals during the day, but we were actually wrong. We saw more at night, almost double the amount that we saw during the day, whereas sunset was a little bit in the middle. So the last thing that we have to graph is how did different types of animal behaviors change between the night, the sunset, and the day? As you can see here in this first column, the most common behavior that we saw was eating or drinking. We saw animals doing this all the time, and if we saw animals doing any one thing, it was probably this. The next thing that we saw that was kind of interesting that we didn't think we were going to see was calling. A lot of the birds we could see making sounds as well as hear them, and tons of insects and frogs, we could hear them making all sorts of sounds. I didn't expect this, but it was kind of neat. Another thing that we saw a lot of was moving. Many animals just walked, swam, or flew through our webcam as we were watching. We don't know where they were coming from or going, but they seemed to be going somewhere. Another fun thing that we saw was playing. We only saw this a couple times, but we did see some animals playing with each other, which makes sense. But that's pretty much all we got. So what does this all mean? The most common things that we found were insects. This kind of makes sense because there are way more insects on Earth than there are mammals or birds or reptiles. We also saw a lot more insects during the night, as well as frogs. This might be because maybe insects might call to each other during the night to find a mate. As I said, our claim was incorrect because we observed so many things at night, which was way more than in the day. If we think about this a little bit, I maybe had a little bit of bias towards the daytime because I live during the day. I'm not active as night, so I maybe wasn't as willing to think about all the things animals could do at night. One of the other interesting things that we saw in our project was the impact that insects could have on the animals around them. This giraffe that we watched for a few times here, it's hard to tell from the photo, but about every 3 seconds, this giraffe would shake its head like this to shoo off insects around there. We also saw this with many of the elephants and antelope that we saw. It seemed like the insects were really having a big impact on what the animals do. Maybe they would swish their tail or not stay too long in one place because there will always seem to be some type of fly or mosquito landing on and biting these impacts, biting these animals. So kind of what does it all mean? I learned through this project that animals spend a lot of time every day just eating and drinking. If I think about my day, I maybe spend 2 or 3 hours a day eating because I have a refrigerator and can go to the store. But many of these animals don't. And an elephant has to eat a lot of grass throughout the day. It was also interesting to see how different animals and different animal behaviors happened at different times. This makes a little bit of sense because some animals are maybe better at being out during the day, where others are more nocturnal and are better at being around at night. I think maybe some of the insects were out at night and calling so much because predators that might be searching for them, like birds that rely on vision, might be asleep. So maybe when animals did the type of behavior they did depended a little bit on the predators that might be hunting for them. A couple neat things that we saw were some playing. I mentioned this before, but in this screenshot, you can kind of see this baby elephant here is playing with this other baby elephant right next to it. I didn't expect that we would see this, but you can imagine play is an important behavior for young animals to learn the skills that they need to survive in the wild on their own. Another thing we didn't expect to find is calling. The birds or bison or antelope, they all made a lot of noise. I tended to think of nature as someplace kind of quiet, but really, when we listened to the microphone for these webcams, it was really loud. And so all these animals were making all sorts of sounds. I don't really know what they were saying, but I could tell that they were doing something with all that sound. So if we were going to do our research project again, there are a few things that I might want to investigate. One thing was, how does the animal behavior change during the day or night? I mostly watched most of my daytime measurements were in the hours leading up to sunset, and my nighttime measurements were mostly in the handful of hours after sunset. So I wonder what would happen if maybe I watched the animal cameras more during the middle of the day or the morning, or the same thing with the night. What happened in the very middle of the night at 3 or 4 in the morning? I wonder if animals have different behaviors then. The other thing is I only did this over 1 week. Right now, it's spring in the northern hemisphere and fall in the southern hemisphere, where many of these animals in Africa are. I wonder what might happen during winter or summer or different rainy or dry seasons in Africa, and how that might affect their behavior. The last thing that would be kind of neat to investigate is how calling impacts other animals. What would happen if we heard a lion roar? Would everything go quiet, or would animals keep chattering amongst each other? Because that was some of the most common things we heard, it'd be neat to investigate that more. So that's all for my research project presentation. I hope this gives you a good example as to what type of presentation you could do, and that you learned a little bit about animal behavior here.
Your homework for today's lesson is to finish your presentation and then share it with us, your friends, parents, or science teachers. You saw all sorts of really cool animal behaviors, so make sure you tell us about it. You can share it with me at spencer@headwatersscienceinstitute.org, and we'd love to see what you've done.
Well, that's all for today's lesson and this 3-part series on using animal cameras to study animal behavior. We all learned a ton about animals and why they do the things they do. My favorite thing that I learned was that how something as small as a fly could affect something as big as an elephant. I hope you can join us back here next Monday, where we're going to start a new video series studying a different system that you can create your own research project around. See you next time.